Let's talk about Mr. Potential himself, Megumi. After the recent chapters, what can we expect from him going forward? I'm going to talk about that and a bunch of other manga questions from you guys, so spoilers beware. Alright, so as of chapter 258, our boy Megumi is still lost in the sauce. He has given up and Yuji and the others have not been able to get through to him yet. I don't think all hope is lost, but even if they do get through to Megumi, we're not so sure he's going to have a happy ending, right? But for the purposes of this video, let's assume that Megumi does return, in whatever form that may take, but Megumi gets re-control of his body, or he gets agency back. You know, maybe Sukuna goes back to Yuji, whatever the case may be, but Megumi comes back. What is that going to mean for him, especially with the recent theme in the manga being about how strong Yuji is from having housed Sukuna as a vessel? Well, now Megumi will have that same advantage, right? Now, not as long as Yuji, but I do think he's had it long enough to take away some benefits from this. So let's talk about this, and let's start with the angle from Calcifer's question here, which is, will Megumi learn how to do an open domain thanks to Sukuna? And I certainly think this is possible. The important thing here is that Megumi already knew how to do a domain expansion before Sukuna, right? And it was incomplete, but he still had the bare bones, the structure. So now with Sukuna's experience, if you will, he will know how to complete this, in my opinion. Now, does it have to be an open domain? I don't think so. I think he could just similarly learn how to close his incomplete domain, just because open domains are like the pinnacle, right? We haven't even seen Gojo do this. So I don't think just because Sukuna did it in his body means Megumi will be able to do the same. You know, similarly, we should be able to see Yuji do an open domain since Sukuna did the same thing in his body, right? But I don't necessarily expect that. And again, with the main benefit of open domains being how much larger they are, they don't necessarily need that benefit against Sukuna, right? Because it's just one person that they're trying to capture in there. Well, you know, presumably, we'll see how things shake out if Megumi loses his mind or not. But yes, I do think Megumi, when he comes out the other side of this, will have a completed domain, but jury's still out on whether that means it'll be open or closed. Domain expansion aside, though, I'm more so interested for just the creative ways Sukuna showed Megumi that the shadows could be used. You know, using Maharaga's wheel for himself, the way he used Max's elephant's piercing blood water attack, you know what I'm saying? So I honestly don't expect, like, Megumi to come back and go Super Saiyan and, like, have this huge redemption arc where he's, like, wielding all of these new powers. Like, maybe we get, like, some slice of that. But again, so, like, I don't really expect these things to be fully fleshed out. Like, maybe we see him do a domain if he comes back, but just like conceptually, I think Megumi would have learned a lot just from the creative use of the 10 shadows, so I would be excited to see how he wields that. And then speaking of the 10 shadows, I got this question from Rod, and y'all feel free to pause and read the whole thing if you'd like, but he's essentially asking how the 10 shadows technique may have evolved or changed from person to person. This is in reference to a video I put out recently describing the differences between how Yuji uses the cleave and dismantle attack of Shrine versus how Sukuna does. We know Yuji has the little scissors icon, right? So check out that video if you want more of an explanation of like why people's techniques might be different. But for the 10 shadows specifically, I don't think it would be that different in the same way Yuji and Sukuna are, because with the 10 shadows, we know that those 10 Shikigami are the same across all users, because we know Maharaga has existed in the legends, that's not the right word, but like the Zenin clan has like a guidebook for the 10 shadows. So the Shikigami are a constant, if you will. So in that regard, you know, Megumi using it isn't going to be different than the dude from 1,000 years ago. But I do think there's nuance in how they use it and maybe creative things that they do. But like Megumi's Maharaga isn't going to be different from his granddad's Maharaga. Not really, if you know what I mean. So I do think the differences would come in how they use the shadows not related to the Shikigami. Like, for example, how we see Megumi like go into the shadows and store stuff in the shadows. Like, I think that stuff could be kind of creatively interpreted different, depending on era or depending on person. Now, obviously, shadows aren't really something that are that malleable. There's really not too many ways to think about shadows, but I do think there's wiggle room for creativity there. So to answer your question, no, it wouldn't be different Shikigami, but I do think there's room for personality within the 10 shadows. And then for your second question on what techniques could I see evolving over different eras, I really think like 90% of them you could come up with some creative new applications for. But to give you a couple of specific examples, I would say the creation technique that we see both Yorozu and Mai use, that's one I could definitely see evolving, just because 1,000 years ago when Yorozu was stomping around, like certain inventions or weapons didn't even exist, right? So unless Yorozu invented them and came up with them, she was never going to be able to create them, right? Meanwhile, we flash forward to Mai 1,000 years later, then there's all these weapons and guns that exist that she could potentially create with that now. And then another example that it's a slightly different direction would be like projection sorcery, right? We know that's based on 24 frames because of 24 frame per second animation. Well, as animation evolves, or, just that, it doesn't have to be animation, but just that type of video technology evolves, then perhaps that technique would evolve and go from 24 to 30 or even 60 FPS. So I think you could really just get creative with it. Next up, we got this question from Clint on, do I think it's a coincidence the 4 main protagonists will be able to damage the soul, meaning Yuji, Megumi, Nobara, and Gojo. So Yuji, we know, can perceive the soul and damage it thanks to sharing a body with Sukuna. So if Megumi comes out the other side of this, then he too should have that ability. We know Nobara can thanks to her fight with Mahito, and then Gojo has the 6 eyes. So can he see souls? Can he perceive the soul? I think it's probably fair to say that he can, but we don't know for sure. So I don't want to say that he absolutely can, at least not in the same way that we know Yuji is able to. Because we know that during the whole Gojo Sukuna fight, there wasn't really this conversation of Gojo attacking the barrier between Sukuna and Megumi's body, right? There was no kind of conversation about Sukuna's output falling each time Gojo punched him. So to that end, you would say that maybe Gojo can't damage the soul in the same way Yuji can. But again, the 6 eyes are the 6 eyes, so, who knows? And maybe Gojo can see the soul, sort of, but maybe not in the same way that allows him to damage it. I don't want to get too long-winded on this. I just want to say that we don't know Gojo can do this for sure, but we'll just call it a wash for your question. Because do I think it's a coincidence? No. I think Gege has been telling a very philosophical story, very focused on the soul and the body, so it's no surprise to me that the main characters would be involved in that discussion, whether directly or indirectly. And for your second question here on when, not if, Nobara returns, will she come back with her powers awakened? I'm still not convinced she's going to return. Obviously, she's in limbo very intentionally from Gege, so I could see her re-entering the story in some fashion, but not necessarily like showing up, jumping from the top rope to help finish off Sukuna. So not necessarily with some big awakening of her powers. Would that be badass? Like, sure, I'd love to see it. I'd love to see her domain just to see like what Gege would come up with. But, I'm not holding my breath, but, again, Gege left that so vague for a reason. So I'm interested to see how he picks up that thread. Next up on the Soul Talk, we got this question from Munch Crunch, who wants to know if Yuji had to swap with somebody else to learn RCT. Might he have learned it just from swapping with Kusakabe thanks to Sukuna being in his body and performing RCT before, plus having blood manipulation, which is going to help with the process of RCT. So y'all pause, read the whole thing if you'd like, but I think Yuji did have to swap with somebody with RCT, even given that, just because Choso even says as much, I think, in the chapter that, like, Yuji, one of your swaps needs to be with somebody with RCT. So yes, Sukuna did do it in his body, but Yuji wasn't in control, right? The benefit of this soul swap is that, like, Yuji is piloting somebody else's body. So he was piloting Kusakabe, and that's how he was able to learn Simple Domain. So theoretically, if Yuji swapped with Shoko, then he would be actually the one doing RCT himself in order to learn how that process works. So I think for that reason, he did swap with somebody to learn RCT, plus the statement from Choso. Because, yeah, Kusakabe, I don't believe, has RCT, and the Sukuna experience wouldn't have been enough on its own. And finally, we got this question from Andrew. I'll move out of the way for anybody that wants to pause, but essentially it's asking, are there multiple souls inside of Yuji right now thanks to the Curse Womb death paintings? And I personally don't think there are, just because the rest of the Curse Wombs weren't as sophisticated or powerful as Choso, so they're not exactly like him. And in this interview you referenced down here, Gege does explicitly tell us that if Yuji ate the Curse Wombs, he would just get power from them. He doesn't reference any type of like shared body situation like with Yuji and Sukuna. So in essence, they're there, but like I don't think they're actually there. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching.